All right, let's talk about one of the biggest headaches for leaders, especially if you're in hospitality. You have this amazing strategy, right? But then there's this huge, frustrating gap between your plan and what actually happens on the ground. Whether you're driving guest safety, new sustainability goals, or just top-notch quality, this is the gap that can sink even the best ideas.
Okay, let's kick things off with a number that should really make you stop and think. Research from Harvard Business Review says that a whopping 67% of well-thought-out strategies, well, they fail. We're talking 2 out of every 3. That's just a crazy high number. And it tells us something is seriously broken somewhere between the boardroom and the front desk.
So, for years, what's the usual excuse? Poor execution, right? The thinking is always, hey, this strategy was perfect, but the team just didn't get it done. It's an easy way to point the finger, but honestly, it's a trap. And as we're about to see, it's a completely misleading one.
So, what if the problem isn't bad execution at all? What if it's actually a failure to learn? That's the big idea we're diving into. We're going to look at 5 totally counterintuitive truths from some of the best strategic minds out there that will flip this whole problem on its head. This isn't about finding someone to blame. It's about completely rewiring how you think about strategy itself. All right, let's jump into our first truth. This one takes aim at a classic move. When a team or a property is struggling, what do? We throw a huge, audacious goal at them. You know, a bag. We've all seen it happen. But here's the twist. Research shows that can be the absolute worst thing you can do when your team's already feeling the pressure. Yeah, there's actually a name for this. Researchers Sim Sitkin, Chet Miller, and Kelly C. call it the stretch goal paradox. And it's pretty fascinating. It basically says that the very same goal can either light a fire under a successful team or completely crush a struggling one. That one big goal can be the difference between a huge win and a total flop. Just think about how this plays out psychologically. Let's say you have a hotel that's firing on all cylinders. You tell them, we're going to be the #1 rated hotel in the city. They see that as an awesome challenge, an opportunity. But now, take a team that's dealing with guest complaints and feeling beat down. You give them that same goal, and it doesn't feel like an opportunity. It feels like a threat. And poof, motivation is gone.
So what do you do instead? Well, for that struggling team, forget the moonshot for a minute. The real key is to focus on small wins. We're talking about tangible, achievable goals that build momentum. For that hotel, maybe it's just improving the breakfast service score by 5% this month. You get that win, and suddenly there's confidence, there's energy. You're building a foundation to aim higher later on.
Okay, this idea of building on what actually works on the ground leads us perfectly into our next couple of truths. And these, well, they really challenge the whole idea of where strategy is supposed to come from. We're about to turn that old top-down model completely upside down.
Get this, a 10-year study from Ron Carucci found something pretty shocking. He discovered that 85% of leadership teams spend less than 1 hour a month talking about strategy. Can you believe that? They get so bogged down with internal stuff, budgets, politics, you name it, that they totally lose sight of what's happening outside their own walls, with customers and competitors. Their strategy ends up having zero connection to the real world.
I love this quote from Harvard's Rosabeth Moss-Kanter. She says that strategy isn't some perfect script you write in a quiet room. It's much more like improv theater. You don't just memorize lines. You get on stage, you try something, you see how the audience, your customers, reacts, and you adjust on the fly. It's all about that real-time feedback.
So what's the big takeaway? True strategy doesn't come from a top-down plan. It bubbles up from what you learn on the ground. So leaders, your job is to encourage your teams to experiment. Try that new check-in process. Test out a new sustainability idea. Pilot a new safety protocol. Find out what actually works with real guests, and then call it your strategy. Suddenly, execution isn't about following orders. It's about discovering the plan.
And that brings us to our last 2 truths. And honestly, this is where things get really radical. We are about to completely flip the script on who does what when it comes to strategy and execution in your company.
So forget thinking about your strategy as some kind of sacred, rigid plan. Instead, think of it as a scientific hypothesis. Amy Edmondson and Paul Verdon came up with this idea. Your strategy is really just your best guess about how to succeed. And your execution, that's the experiment you run to find out if your guess was any good.
And in hospitality, this is huge. Okay, imagine you roll out a new sustainability initiative with low-flow shower heads, but then your housekeeping team tells you that guests are complaining. Now, the old way of thinking would be to call that an execution problem, but it's not. That's priceless strategic data. It's telling you your hypothesis was flawed.
Your frontline team, they have the most valuable strategic information in your entire company.
This all leads to a complete 180 of the traditional model, an idea from thinker Roger L. Martin. He says the people making hundreds of choices every single day, the front desk agent handling a tricky guest situation, the kitchen manager choosing a new vendor, they are the ones actually creating the strategy. So in this new world, strategy is a job for everyone. And execution, believe it or not, that's the CEO's job.
Wait, what does that even mean? How is execution the CEO's job? Well, here's a great explanation from Verizon exec Andres Irlando. He says, the CEO's main job isn't to make all the little decisions. It's to build and manage the system, the choice cascades that helps everyone else make smart choices that all line up. The CEO's job is to execute the whole system of strategy.
So let's bring this all home. What does this mean for you, for your teams, especially when you're working on really critical goals around health, safety, or sustainability? It means you need a totally new playbook, one that's built around learning, not just planning.
Look, it's a massive mental shift. We have to ditch that old, rigid plan then do model. It's been failing for decades, right? The new way is to think of it as a learning loop. It's dynamic, it's continuous. The stuff you learn from the front lines is constantly flowing back to make the strategy better and better in real time.
And here is the single biggest takeaway from all of this. That gap between your strategy and what actually happens, the one we're all so afraid of, it's not a failure, it's not a problem to be solved. It's actually the source of your best information. It's the friction between your plan and reality, and that friction creates the data you need to learn, to adapt, and in the end, to win.
So that leaves us with one last question for you to take back to your team as you're looking at all your big goals for this year. Which one of these truths really challenges the way you're doing things right now? Because I'll tell you what, the second you stop seeing that gap as a problem and start seeing it as your best teacher, that's the second you really start to close it for good.